Hello everyone! Welcome to our game development tutorial. Today we are going to start developing a Space Invaders game. This will be the first part of the tutorial. So the tutorial will be divided in several parts, and our goal is to develop a game that looks like a Space Invaders. For those that are not familiar with Space Invaders, it's a 2D game where you control a spaceship and you have to destroy the asteroids and also the enemies. So that's what we're going to develop. We're going to use Vizzcode to develop the game, so we can have visual programming. So we can develop using visual programming. And our goal here is for you to really learn how to develop games. So the knowledge here is not to simply use node that you call in it already creates the entire game for you. So you have to really think logically how to develop the game and build each step. And this knowledge that you acquire here in this tutorial will be awesome for you, so you can use that in other game engines and also in other programming stuff, because it's you're gonna really learn the real deal behind game development. So let's get started without further ado. You can use Vizzcode in Portuguese or in English, and you can start a blank project or using a tutorial. Here I'm going to select a tutorial the tutorial of this game, Space Invaders, because I want to follow with you guys, so you can see some stuff here in the tutorial. But I'm not gonna follow the tutorial step by step. I just want to show you some cool stuff in the embedded tutorial. So here you have the advanced Space Invaders and the basic. We're gonna build the entire Space Invaders here in this tutorial, so you can come here and start the tutorial. So the good thing about Vizzcode is that you can use visual programming and text programming at the same time. So you can learn with the visual programming, that is way easier for beginners, but you can also use text code that gives you more power. So that's why we're gonna use here in Vizzcode to develop game invaders, because the knowledge here will really be useful for you as a game developer and also as a programmer that wants to learn more about game development. So here's the main interface of Vizzcode. You can follow the tutorial here, and so that's the goal of the game that we want to make. So that's the art. I'm kind of in front of the game, but that's the main concept. So you have the number of ships that you destroyed, the asteroids, the enemies that shoot at you, the sound effects. And you have to program everything by hand, but it's gonna be cool because of the visual programming. So the process is really nice. So here you can follow the tutorial along, but you can also download the assets. That's right, you won't have to do any art here. So you have the assets for you. So click in this link and you're gonna download the asset. And once you download the asset, you go to the Space Invaders, the project that you created, and you copy the assets here. So that's the assets. There will be sound, like so that's the sound. There's the sound of the enemy shot. So that's some pretty cool stuff. And also the explosion, the letters, the bullets. So you have everything in here. So let's go back to Vizzcode and let's get started. First of all, I have to tell you guys the difference between game development and programming. So when you are developing a game, the game runs forever. So the game is looping forever, and at each frame of the game, so those that you are familiar with playing games, you have the FPS, frames per second. So usually the game runs 30 to 60 frames per second, and at each frame you have the input. So you read what the user did. So if he clicked the mouse to shoot, if he moved to the right using the D or using the arrow keys, so you read the input of, or if he didn't do anything, you simulate based on what he did and what's already going on in the game, and you render the what you simulated and you show to the user. So at each frame you generate an image to show on the user screen, but you have a lot of frames per second, so it really looks like it's moving. But the main thing is you have the game loop running and you simulate at each frame, and it generates an image. You're gonna see it really clear, so you can read more about that here. So I'm gonna leave the tutorials here in this image as the main goal of what we're developing, but we're not gonna use it anymore. So let's start importing a library. So here you go, a new library. So we're gonna call the game engine. So this library has all the functions that we need to use for the game engine to create the game. So we imported the library, so and then we go to the new procedure and have the main procedure. That's where we put all the commands. So as I said, let's start creating the game using the while loop. So the while loop, while the game is running, so that's the main core of the game. So at each frame will be while, and this is certifying that the game will run until you close the window. So you put everything that you want to simulate inside here of the game loop. So let's another difference of the game engine is that when you import the game engine, you don't have that console window anymore. You have a custom window. As you can see, if you compile and run, you can see that window here. So that's where we're gonna put everything about the game. So let's start drawing a bitmap. So that will be the background of the game. To draw a bitmap, we call the draw bitmap function, and here you can see all the parameters that you can pass. So the file that you're gonna put here is inside, as we put the assets are inside the project folder, but you are inside the assets folder. So you are the main folder is project, and inside the project you have assets, and then inside assets you have background.png. So if you compile the game and run, you can see here there's something black. That's the background, but it's too small, so let's make it bigger. So let's put a new size to the background. The position is in the center, so that's good, but let's put a new size for the background. Let's see if it runs. Oh, now it's good, right? That's the space. Once we start playing the game, we can animate the background too. Gonna be that parallax effect, would be really cool. But that's the main background of the game. So we have at each frame we're gonna draw background to the game, so it really looks really good. And to start actually, so let's put it in here, because what's the main thing about the game? That's the player, right? Without the player you don't have the game. So let's create the player, right? Here on Vizzcode and on most game development, the players are usually in an object. So we create a new variable that will be called player. That player will be an object, so we create an object. So that player is an object now. So so we create an object. As you guys know, the computer only simulates what we are typing here. What we did here is just created a variable and said it's an object. If you compile the game and run, you guys will see that nothing changed. So what we're gonna do, we have to spawn that player, right? We have to put the player inside the game, spawning it. So let's call the spawn object function or procedure. So to spawn the player, we have the object ID. So what we want to spawn? We want to spawn the player. So that's the ID. And where do we want to spawn? 0 and 0. So if we spawn like this, 0 0, that's the player, right? We didn't put any clothes, any bitmap on the player, so that's a square, and we put it on the screen. We put in the center of the screen. So if we put 10, you see that it moved a little. If we put 20, it moved a little more, but we want the player at the default parameter, that's the center. So we have the player on the screen, but the player doesn't look like what we want. The player has to look like a ship, right? A spaceship. So let's set an object bitmap. Set object bitmap. As you guys can see here, you can follow along. You have a lot of functions, procedures, right? Procedures or functions, you can call them as you like. Here on Vizzcode, you usually call them procedures. So you can have a lot of procedures to play with the player. So here we want to set the object bitmap. Here we just draw the bitmap. Here we want to set the object bitmap. What's the object ID? That's the player. And what's the file name? The file name is in assets, right? Inside the projects folder. And the name is player.png. So let's compile and run, and that's it, guys. That's the player. Looks really cool, right? But if I press the WASD or the arrow keys, nothing will happen because we didn't tell the computer to do so. For now, the player is static here, just as we set it to be, to spawn the player and to draw the bitmap. That's the cool thing about the Vizzcode, because the way you program here is really clear and it's really logical. I mean, you're building the player, the game, and using the procedures, so you can really learn programming and really understand what you're doing. I want to show you guys something before we move on, is that as you guys can see, we use the spawn object, set object, bitmap. Here if we press, you can see that we have a lot of procedures available for us. If you guys jump to Vizzcode's website, here we can have in Portuguese or in English. You can download Vizzcode here, but you can also access the documentation. And when you go to the documentation, you have the game engine, where we're gonna show you guys all the procedures available in the game engine. So it's pretty cool. It's huge. You guys can search it, so you guys can really learn and see how it works in examples. So if you have any doubts, for example, the bitmap, for example, bitmap. So there's a lot of bitmaps. Draw bitmap. So draw bitmap, you can say that the procedure immediately draws a specific image on the screen, so it explains everything that we are using. So it's really cool for you guys to follow along. And of course, you also have the tutorial embedded here that tells everything that I'm saying here written down for you guys to follow. So we have the player, but the player is not moving yet. What we have to do, we have to set the object movement, right? So we call the function set object movement, as we did here with the bitmap. We also can set the movement. So that's the same thing. We have the object ID, that's the player, and the movement here is the standard movement. So that's the standard parameter that you send here. So if you don't do anything, the movement will be player all directions. Let me jump back here into the documentation just one more time to show you guys something. Then if we search here, player movement. So if we get, well, what's the name of the function? Let me set object movement here. So if we use set object movement, we can leave the standard parameter here, player all directions, that's the WASD, or we can use like player up, down, WSD only. So I have a lot of things that you can use here to create the object's movement. So you guys can follow along here. So we're gonna leave here. So what will supposed to happen, right? So I'm saying that the player can move at all directions. So let's compile the game, let's run here, and you can move the player using the WASD or the arrow keys. So the game starts to get to life, right? So it's really cool. You see the movement of the player, but the player is not shooting yet, right? It's a shooter game, so you have to shoot. So let's create the shooting object, the shoot, right? The particle, there will be the shot. So using the same logic here, we create a new variable. There will be the shot, and will be an object. So we create an object. As you guys can see here in the right, the code appears as you type, and you can edit the code here, and you can play with both ways. I'm just using the visual programming for now because it's easier to follow, but once you get used to the development here, you can start programming here on the right using the text as you like. So we created an object, but as I said, we just created the object, we didn't do anything, but we have to tell the computer to also set this object bitmap. So you have to put the clothes on the shot, right? So that's the set object bitmap as we used with the player. So now we can keep pushing here, or we can compile. Oh, we're not gonna be able to compile because we need the object ID, that's the shot. But once we compile here, you can rearrange the nodes so it's gonna look nice for you. So you can rearrange as you like. To move here, you hold the right mouse button. You can zoom in or zoom out using the scroll, and you can select here, move here using the left mouse button. Pretty cool. So so we have the set object bitmap. So the object bitmap is in assets slash will be called the player bullet. So that's the bullet that the player is gonna shoot. Bullet here. So once again, if we compile and run, nothing's gonna happen because we didn't spawn that bullet, right? Well, what's the thing? We spawn the player here outside the loop because we know that the player needs to be inside the game scene. But the shot, right? The shot particle, you need only when the player press the shoot button. So we can't keep spawning the shots everywhere. So we need to go inside the while loop, and we have to test here if the player pressed a button. So if a button is pressed by the player, we're gonna leave space. You can choose the button that you like here. So I'm gonna add it for you guys to see. So it's X. We can say that it's Y, but I want to leave it as space. So I can say space like this, or we can leave it blank because that's the default parameter. So if the player press space, what we want to happen? We want to spawn an object. And what object will that be? That will be the shot object. So if compile and run, you're gonna see that every time I press space, the object is spawned here. If I get here bigger, you're gonna see that as I press space, the object's getting the color is stronger because there's a lot of objects in front of the other. But what's the problem? Once I press space, the object is still, and the object is in the middle of the screen, in the center of the screen. And why? Because we just said to spawn an object and the position is 0, 0. So what we have to do? First of all, we have to make this object move. And how we're gonna do that? We're gonna go here in set object bitmap. After we set the shot bitmap, we can use the function or the procedure set object movement. So the object, what's the object? Shot will be not the movement, right? The movement is for the player. If we set here on the object, let us see what's gonna happen. So that's really cool, right? So we can do like something like this. So I'm moving the particles, but we don't want that, right? We want to set a constant velocity. Set object constant velocity. So the shot, when it's spawn, will have a constant velocity. Well, where do you want that velocity to be? So that's the x and the y and the x. So if we put the velocity here in the x, if I press space, the movement will be to the right. If we put like minus 200, the movement will be to the left. But if we go here on the y position, that's what we want, right? That looks like a shot, but I think it's too big. Let me mess here with the size, so I can put the size to 1. The size of, look, so I created an object shot, and I'm setting the object bitmap. So the bitmap is the player bullet, and the new size is 1. So if I do that, oh, looks really good, right? So I can also do that with the spaceship. It's 5. We can make it bigger if we want to. So that's a bigger spaceship, but I think that 5 is a good size for the spaceship. So let's leave it blank, right? 5. So we have the constant velocity, and we can mess here with the velocity too. We can make it faster. Let us see. That's so fast that we can even see the bullet. Let me put like 600. So that's the bullet really fast. I think that, but look, it's still from the center of the screen. I think that 180 is a good velocity. You guys can mess with these numbers at home if you want to make the spaceship bigger, the shots faster. You guys can do as you wish. But now what we have to do, we have to make the bullet come out of the player. So how do we do that? We need the position of the player. So inside the game loop, so while the game is running, what we have to do? We have to get the player position. But here when developing a game, when you spawn an object, the object becomes an instance of that object. So we can't have the location of the player's object. We have to find the location of the instance of that player's object. But we spawn only one object, so we can find the first instance of that object. If there's a lot of instances, for example, the shots, that we have a lot of instances if we are pressing space really fast, so we need to find which instance do we want. We're gonna learn that in a while. But for the case of the player, there's only one instance, we can find the next instance. So we need to get the position. To do that, I'm gonna get a new variable. So we need the player X, but we also need the player Y position. So I'm gonna create another variable here. So that's player Y, player X and Y. So I need to get the instance position, right? So I'm gonna call here get instance position. So I can, as you guys can see, that getting instance position is returning the position X and position Y. But what's the instance that we need? What's the identification of that instance? So I need to get the first instance. As I said, we can call the object. So get first instance. So of which object? So now get first instance, we can pass the object as a parameter. That's the player object. So I'm gonna return the instance, and here I'm gonna return the position. So get first instances, as I said, will return the first instance of the object that was created and is in that scene. So as we know, we only have one instance of the player, so we can use here. Now that we have the player's position, we can come here and spawn the object, the shot, on a position that we want. So the position of X, that's the exactly position of the player. So I'm gonna put player X. But the position in the Y-axis, we need it to be a little higher than the center of the player, because we need the shot to come off the gun of the spaceship, right? So we're gonna have like player Y plus 5. Let us see if it looks good. If we compile and run. Now that looks really cool, right? So that's the game. We can move around, we can shoot, but as you guys can see, we can go off the screen. There's no enemies, no asteroids, but we already have the basic movement. So I'm gonna finish this video here. I'm not gonna add anything more to this game. I'm gonna do that on the second part. I think that we learn a lot here, so we can digest the knowledge and try to experiment here, try to create a new object, the enemy object, using the same logic that we did with the player and the shot. I think that you can come up with some really cool stuff. But before we finish, I want to go back to what we did, so we can rearrange the nodes. As I said, you can mess around here and the nodes will appear for you. And we only use the visual because it's way easier for the beginner. But I'm gonna go back to everything that we did using the code, so you can get started to get used to the code. So first of all, we created an object of the player. So we created a player object. We spawned that player object to the scene, but that player was a white square. So what we did, we put a bitmap to that player. So that's the player PNG inside the assets that you're gonna download. Use the link here in the tutorial. After that, we set the object movement to be the default movement, player all directions here. Because of the default parameter, it's not showing here. If you change the parameter to something else, for example, the parameter will be passed here, will be the parameter player, so the object movement to the player and the movement that you want, but we want player all directions, so it's here. After that, the player can be controlled by you, by the user, by the player. So after that, we create a new object, that's the shot, that bullet, and we set that object bitmap to player bullet and the size to 1, so we made it a little smaller. We also set the constant velocity, so every time when a shot is spawned, it will have a constant up velocity. That's the velocity of 180 in the y-axis. So that's everything that is happening before the while loop. So now we enter the while loop. So now everything that is inside the while loop will be will run at each frame of the game. So we know that each game usually have between 30 to 60 frames. So each frame is a still image that we draw after what happened here. But because we have a lot of images going on, it looks like it's in a movement, right? So at each frame, we're gonna draw the bitmap, so the game will have the background. As you guys remember in the beginning of the video, when I created the screen, it was a gray screen. Now I have the background, the space background of the size 120, and at each frame we get the player's position, so player X and player Y, where the player is in the game, and we get the instance position, right? Every object in the game is an instance, and we get the first instance of the player, of the object player, the first instance, because we only have one player in the game. So we're gonna test at each frame that if a button is pressed, if the button space is pressed, we don't have to say that again because it's the default parameter. So if the button space is pressed, we're gonna spawn an object shot at the player X position and player Y plus 5 position. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, the first part of the tutorial. So you can follow along here inside Vizzcode in the tutorials. If you can't wait for part 2, you can go inside Vizzcode and start building more of the game. Or if you want to do it by yourself, you can come here in Vizzcode website and you can see all the procedures that you have available inside the game engine library, and you also can read about making games here in the documentation. So that's the games that you have the assets ready for you, so you don't have to do the art. So that's a kind of a Flappy Bird game that we're gonna also teach you, and you have that in a tutorial inside Vizzcode. That's the shooting range. You have tic-tac-toe, some information here, but you can also draw your bitmaps and do as we did here using the pre-made assets. So you can do the game that you want using Vizzcode with this knowledge that you're learning here. So let me go back here to finish the game while we play it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I see you guys in the next part. Bye!